Okay, so for 13.4 part 2, we're going to look at the sine and the cosine graph in more detail. Last time we looked at them, and the things to remember is that when you look at y equals sine of x and y equals cosine of x, just start with 0. And so sine of 0, the 0 degrees, notice there's no y value at 0 degrees. And so we know that the sine of 0 is going to be 0, 0 when the sine is 0. And so sine always starts at the origin, and then it goes like this. Remember, the two important things is that one period of this sine, meaning one part before it repeats itself, is going to always be 2 pi. And then it's going to have a min and a max of 1 and negative 1 when at these two peaks, or these two, the hills in the graph. And those just keep repeating themselves over and over and over again. And so that is the way that graph works. The cosine graph is the exact same looking graph, except that it starts at 0, 1 and goes like this for one repeat instead of 1, 0. But the nice thing is it has the same amplitude, the same height, the minimum and maximum. So remember that amplitude is going to be the distance from this midline, which is the x-axis in the basic case, and the min and the max. The min and the max are going to be the actual points. So for today, what we're going to do is we're going to look about how an equation is going to look as compared to, and you can find these different things. Your book doesn't give us a nice standard way of looking at this, and so we're going to look at it as what happens with, and there's actually 4 components. We're only going to look at 3 today. Y equals a sine of bx plus c. So there's 3 variables here that we've introduced. One of them is multiplying times the sine function. The second one is multiplying by what's inside the sine function. And then the third thing is adding to the sine function. And so what that really does is we're multiplying by the y value by a. We're adding to the y value by c. And then the b actually changes the input. So let's talk about each one of these. So the first 2 are the A and the C. What you can say is the amplitude, if you remember, is from the midline to the graph. The amplitude to the top and the bottom of the graph, the amplitude is always, will always be A. So it's a really nice thing. And so if it's 4 sine of 3x, 4 is going to your amplitude. The midline is always y equals c. You're just adding this to each of the coordinates. And so if that's a 4, then you've just added 4 to everything. And so you've moved your graph up. We call that a vertical shift of the graph up c units. If it's a negative value, then it's down c units. And then these 2 combined give us a min-max of the function. Well, you go to the midline of c, and then the amplitudes adds a for the max and subtracts a for the min. Now, if you get a negative value for a, that's going to be dealt with differently, and we'll talk about what that means. What it really means is you just take the initial point and you flip it down. And so instead of it going up and up, you go down, up, and down. And so we'll talk about that later. And so our min-max just turns out to be the midline value, which is c, and then a and c minus a, assuming a, just always consider a to be positive, even if you get a negative a when you're doing the problem. So c and a are really easy to deal with amplitude and midline and min-max. And then the second one is what b does, and we covered this last time in more detail. And that is you have a period of 2 pi over b. And so this is the formula you really need to remember. The period of a trig function is always going to be 2 pi over b, where b is what is being multiplied by the x value inside. So what the things you're going to be asked is you need to be able to look at an equation and tell us the amplitude, the min-max, and then the period. And so, for example, I might have one like this. You get y equals 3 times sine of 1/2 x minus 2. So let's do the amplitude and the min and max first. Our amplitude is going to be 3. And so we know our amplitude is equal to 3. And then this, we're shifting it up. It's actually going to be a shift down of -2. So just to kind of sketch out the graph, right? Normally we'd start 0, 0 at 0, 0 for a sine graph, but instead we're starting at now -2. And so our graph then is going to go like this. And notice what it does is the amplitude is 3. So what's the min and the max going to be? Well, the max is going to be 1 because your midline was y equals -2. So you add 3 to that to get to this maximum point right here, which has a y value of 1. Remember, the y value is the function value, right? We know that if we have y equals sine of x, it's the same as f of x equals sine of x. And so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the min and the max. And then the min is just going to be -2 minus 3. And so the minimum value is just going to be -5. And then the last part of it is the period. And so the period, we know that we have b is 1/2. And so the period is just going to be 2 pi over 1/2, which turns out to be equal 4 pi. And so the period on this graph just turns out to be 4 pi. All right, so one more example of this. If we have y equals 1/3 cosine of pi over 3x plus, let's say, 1/2. And so this is a pretty complicated one. Again, our amplitude is just what we're multiplying the cosine function by. And so our amplitude just is 1/3, which means our graph is getting, is going to be flattened out. It's going to be a very flattened out thing. If you've been paying attention to the world right now, we're trying to flatten curves all the time. So we're multiplying it by 1/3. And so our then midline, well, we're adding 1/2 to our function. So that means we're just shifting the function up 1/2. And so the max and min, the max is just going to be 1/2 plus 1/3, which turns out to be 5/6. And then the min is just going to equal 1/2 minus 1/3, which turns out to be 1/6. So you're just adding 1/3 to the midline and subtracting 1/3 to the midline. And then our period, well, remember the formula for period, it's 2 pi over b. Well, b in this case is pi over 3, so 2 pi over pi over 3. Well, the pi's are going to be canceled, and 2 over 1/3 just turns out to be 6. And so this one actually has a a rational period, which the basic one doesn't have a rational period because it's in terms of pi, but our pi's canceled out, and so it now has a rational period. Okay, and so the last thing we'll look at is you're going to have some problems today where you're given the maximum value, you're given the minimum value, and you're given the period, and you've got to find the equation. And so the maximum value, they're going to give you as a capital M. So let's say the maximum value of your problem is 4. You're going to have your M. The minimum value is going to be a lowercase m, and let's say that is 1. And then your period is going to be given to you as, let's say it is 4. And you've got to go through and you've got to find the equation of this. Your equation will be written as a sine of bx plus c. And so these are all going to be sine. You could do this with cosine as well, but we're just going to do it with sine. So you want a minimum of 4 and a maximum, or maximum of 4 and a minimum of 1, and then a period of 4. Well, these tell you two things. They tell you where the midline is, which is how much you're shifting it up and down. And they also tell you what the min and the max are, or what the amplitude is. Remember, what we do on these is the amplitude goes up the half this amount and then down this amount. And so the difference between the min and the max is always half the amplitude. So in this case, our amplitude is just going to be the difference between the min and the max divided by 2. So our amplitude is 3/2. And so when we look at our equation, we know it's going to be 3/2 because the amplitude is what we multiply the sine function by. And then we know that C is the midline. The midline is halfway between 4 and 1. And so we got to do 4 plus 1 over 2, which turns out to be 5/2. So the vertical shift on this problem is 5/2, because 5/2 plus 3/2 equals 4. 5/2 minus 3/2 equals 1. And then the last part of this is we need to know what the period is. And so we've solved that equation. The equation for period is simply 2 pi over b equals the period. And so we just set that equal to 4. And so that means that b turns out, you get what, 4b equals 2 pi. So b just turns out to be pi over 2. So to get a period of 4, we need b to equal pi over 2. So our last part of our equation is pi over 2 times x. And so this is the equation of the trig graph given a maximum of 4, a minimum of 1, and a period of 4. And you can apply these principles to any problems given these different things to find that equation.